Well, from detention facilities abroad to those right back here at home, let's turn now to the state of prisons within the U.S. Remember the story we told you about last week where 13 female corrections officers in Baltimore had been indicted for actually helping inmates run drug operations? Well, the union who represents those officers has now responded to that. Representatives say that they have identified several systematic weaknesses at the detention center. They say that a lack of staff might actually have contributed to that problem. Meanwhile, Governor Martin O'Malley insisted the indictment of the inmates in the correctional facility and the correctional officers was, quote, a positive achievement in Maryland's fight against violent gangs. He also defended his prison chief. But let's talk about the system more broadly, the prison system. If correction officers actually could get away with this, what else are they getting away with? Well, I'm joined now by Mac Gaskins. He's a community organizer and prison rights advocate. Mac was a prisoner for 14 years in the Virginia Department of Corrections. Many of them were spent at Red Onion Supermax prison right in Appalachia, not too far from here, where, quote, the worst of the worst are held in confinement.
Yes. Thank you, Maggie.
Mac, thank you so much for joining us. So we talk a lot about this prison industrial complex in a theoretical manner anyway. Can you tell me what that term means to you?
Yeah, so the prison industrial complex, I mean, there's different, like, pieces to that, right? Like, we can't really talk about prison without talking about the judicial system, right? Like, how folks are, like, herded into a prison. Prison is, like, on the back end of it. I'm someone that went to prison at the age of 17 and came home when I was almost 32 years old, so 14 and a half years. And 6 of those were spent in solitary confinement at, like, in my opinion, 2 of the worst prisons in the country. Because of the isolation of these prisons, like no publicity, where I would, like, be tortured in these prisons, like all the other prisoners that were there, like be beaten by the guards, like bit by dogs, shot with rubber bullets that they shoot from a 12-gauge shotgun, have our meals refused on a daily basis. Yeah, like all of the horror stories that you've heard before. I've, like, endured them or witnessed them. I think it's like, when we talk about the prison industrial complex, to, like, get an idea of, like, what prisons, like, what the true role and function of a prison is in this country. And prisons, like, have always in this country, like, represented a place, it's represented like one of the chief repressive institutions, like, in the society. Like, this is where you put political prisoners, people who, like, commit acts that directly challenge the government or, like, the moral fiber of the government and the way society is structured, right? And then once, I like to, like, expand that, though. Like, what does a political prisoner mean? Because almost everyone that's in prison, in some sense, is a political prisoner, in the sense of, if you are a politicized prisoner, like you're someone that comes to prison for, not for political action, but you go to prison and you become politicized, the treatment is pretty much the same as, like, a political prisoner in terms of, like, ever getting released from prison. Like, George Jackson was a politicized prisoner, like one of the most famous prisoners ever. But he didn't go to prison for a political act. But in prison, he became politicized, joined the Black Panther Party, and he never got out of prison. But all of the folks that are in prison for, like, property crimes, and most crimes or property crimes are, like, stem from that, like robberies and theft, crimes of poverty, right? Like, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, most prisoners, like, are in prison because of a political basis. Like, the war on poverty is political. The war on drugs is political. It's not, like, a coincidence.
It's certainly an interesting argument. But let's talk about the justice system. Do you think that people are treated differently within the prison system based on race or based on class or anything like that?
Definitely.
How
Definitely.
so?
Well, I think that most laws are a way to, like, they're geared at certain communities or certain people, right? Like, the law definitely isn't equal across the board, based on class, based on race, right? Like,
but once they get within those, the correctional facility, do you think they're treated differently?
The lines are kind of blurred there, right? But only because most people in prison are poor. Like, you don't have, like, rich people. You don't have any sons of the Waltons, like, in prison. You have poor people in prison, whether they're white, black, Latino, whatever. These prisons up in the Appalachia, in that region, it's very unique because when I came there in 2004, I believe, and it was almost like getting off a slave ship, if, like, it's permissible to talk about the two in the same breath. Because these white folks that lived in that region, they had never interacted with blacks or Latinos before, and all of the folks that were on that bus were black and Latino. So like the racial tension was very high. So it was like racism, right? Like that mentality that's ingrained in people through institutions, right? It had nothing to do with like the whole argument of whether a prison is humane or not. But,
so talk about your personal experience and these alleged torture that you suffered.
yeah. So the day I got to Red Onion State Prison, we were met by like 15 guards at the gate. And they had helmets on, they had on jump boots, they had dogs, and they had guns. And they had a checklist, unbeknownst to anyone on the bus, of all the folks on the bus that needed to be tamed. And I was one of them. I was sent there for allegedly assaulting an officer and like being involved with a work stoppage at Sussex 1 State Prison. So they dragged me off the bus, bring me inside, and begin this process of humiliation, of like strip naked, bend over, and I refused. So they beat me unconscious, they stripped me naked, they dragged me across the yard. I still have scratches on my feet from that incident. And they took me to the super seg unit where the torture like increased, being strapped to beds. They have this practice called 5-point restraints where they put you down on the bed and they leave you there for days.
Unfortunately, we only have a very short amount of time left, but I want to ask you, do you think that people are listening to you? When you say that there's torture going on in the prisons, do you think anyone listens, and why would they listen to a so-called hardened criminal?
Yeah, well, that's, you know, part of this, like, people being like, first of all, ignorance, right? Like people not really knowing what the true role and function of a prison is, like what actually happens inside of a prison. There's a guy, Ron D'Angelo, and he was like the director of corrections in Virginia at one point. And he was doing an interview, and he was asked how can you justify keeping these men locked in their cells 23 hours a day? And his response was that we didn't bring them up here to rehabilitate them, we brought them up here to die. So like all the money for like programs have been cut for these prisons. One time you could get college degrees in prison, like all of that. Like prison is totally punitive now.
It's very interesting, the way that the prison system functions. Matt Gaskins, community organizer and prison rights advocate, thank you for joining us with that personal story.
Thank you.